our next speaker is Steve Ellis. Steve is president of Taxpayers for Common Sense, which is a watchdog group. He has been quoted by probably most of your publications and is an expert on everything from earmarks to other federal budget policy things that I have no understanding of myself. So he's going to talk to you a little bit today about basically how to cover these things and how to help you make them make sense for the average person. And with that, please join me in welcoming Steve.
We've been around since 1995. I got to the organization in 1999. We're a national nonpartisan budget watchdog. We work on a wide range of issues. It includes obviously budget and tax policy, but also national security spending, energy and natural resources, agriculture, and a lot of other areas in between. We focus mostly on the discretionary budget and tax policy. And so, there's a breadth of issues. Yeah, no. So just trying to make sure I know it. All right. So now, so then what do you do to look at the budget? I mean, obviously you're talking about nearly $4 trillion in federal spending, several volumes that are about that tall when you add all the 5 volumes that come out, but that's not even including thousands and thousands of pages of budget justification sheets that are available. And so, well, first off, you talk about, you have the federal budget process. And so you obviously, Thursday, the president's supposed to be rolling out his budget. And this is an aspirational document. And it's something where they're going to lay out all of what they want to do. And, no president ever gets what they want, even if they have full control of House and Senate. Often people talk about the budget as being a doorstop or dead on arrival, but it does provide some interesting information in the actual document, particularly historical tables, which are all, the numbers and are actual fact, as well as some information about what are their priorities and what they're going to push for. So what are some of the sources? So then you have the budget proposal. Obviously, then you go through, and if we do the Schoolhouse Rock version of, then you are going to have a budget resolution from the House and the Senate, and then they're going to combine to do that joint budget resolution to basically all that does is set the top line number for spending. That basically making sure the House and the Senate are in agreement on the top line number so that then they can do their allocations to the individual appropriation subcommittees. Obviously, then continuing just on the Schoolhouse Rock version, they pass each bill individually on time. There's 12 of these appropriation bills, and then those all get enacted by October 1st, the beginning of the new fiscal year. So you can have budget reconciliation, which we can get into too, and clearly it's been a tool in recent years. Not going to happen when you have divided government, though. So anyway, there's various places in this process to inform your readers or viewers about what is going on. And so some of the places, the first thing that I really point out, and it happens too little in Washington, is to read the bill. And that's true of appropriations or any kind of budget document. And so in the back of so one area that I always like to highlight for folks in appropriations is the general provisions, which is the end of that bill. It has all this, because basically you're not allowed to, technically you're not supposed to legislate on appropriations bills. That's a policy measure, but they'll often have limitations. You can't spend any money on this. You can't spend any money to retire any littoral combat ships. That was true in the omnibus. You can't spend any money to promulgate this new rule, things along those lines. And there's interesting stories in that area. So I would highlight the general provisions. And then I'm just showing you some of the tools of what we use to do our analysis. Obviously, the Congressional Budget Office, the official scorekeeper, the nonpartisan scorekeeper for Congress, the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is the same thing but for revenue rather than spending. The GAO obviously is good resources as well, the Government Accountability Office, CRS, the Congressional Research Service, and then, as I've mentioned here now, the President's budget requests and budget justification sheets. Now, the budget justification sheets are where you get into real details about what are these, some of these. So if you find something in the budget that you're interested in, each agency has budget justification sheets. Those are all, and this is so two pieces of legislation that I'm very proud of for transparency and for your benefit that we got enacted, and with others, was one, it's called FFATA, the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, I think. And that created usaspending.gov, which is a good resource. And then just this last Congress, we got the Budget Justification Transparency Act passed, which originally all the budget justification documents were at the agency's websites, tucked away. Sometimes they moved, stuff like that. Those are all now available at usaspending.gov. So that there's one-stop shopping for finding those budget justification sheets. And that's, again, it can be a trove of information. So, and then obviously we're a great resource too. So feel free to pick up the phone and give us a call, 202-546-8500. Or info@taxpayer.net. So what are you should you look for? And in this, and obviously you are all in the storytelling business, and to some extent so am I. So you look for, especially from budget to budget, look for the deltas. That's always, to me, is the most interesting thing. What's the change? What are they doing differently than they did before? And sometimes the story could also be, what are they doing exactly the same that they did before as well? Because in the end, it means that they didn't get accomplished what they wanted to. And there's lots of times that you'll see in president's budgets where they have these, and we're certainly going to see that with President Biden's budget release. There are going to be big tax increases and other proposals in there. But do they actually get any of this accomplished? If they propose this year after year, even if they're kind of complaining in the budget, then it means that they're not really accomplishing it. And sometimes it's just sort of signaling. One area I always saw, and this is true of Democrats and Republicans, is, for instance, the Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps budget is routinely cut by the president based on the previous year's levels because they know Congress is going to add it back. And so they just do, it's a game, and it's been true every single time. I've been looked at a lot of Corps of Engineers budgets. I was a water policy guy before. And so anyway, that's something that it's a gamesmanship that happens, again, between Republicans and Democrats. The other thing, and this is more about the members of Congress, and the president, it's like, what are some of the proposals that aren't being highlighted? What are some of the things that aren't being discussed that is in the budget because they want to just kind of slip it through? And that's also really more true, I think, in appropriations bills. And we certainly saw that with certain lawmakers, that they would get things in, but if they're not touting it, then why are they not touting it? Generic, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but generic are reference items. So things that in legislation that just refer to other legislation. So you want to pull that string to understand better as to what's going on. Again, oddities, press releases, and I'll get to the assets and campaign contributions. And then anything that, especially lawmakers that are doing that is for something out of their district or out of their state, that's also interesting to me. And why are they doing it? All right. So this is a reference, and I mentioned the Corps. So in the appropriations bill several years ago, about 10 years ago, it says that there was a reference in the legislation in the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill that said basically that they could undertake this project authorized by that section at full federal expense. That's all it said. So then we went and we looked at what was in 10653, that was a Water Resources Development Act, which is the authorizing bill for the Corps of Engineers. And it was $1.5 million for a pilot project in the Dog River in Mobile, Alabama. Well, that happened to be represented by Sonny Callahan. That district was represented by Sonny Callahan, who's the chair of the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill and Appropriations Subcommittee, and has a house literally on the Dog River. Like his backyard abuts the Dog River. He had a pier there. So then, working with the Mobile Register at the time, they FOIA'd documents, and literally the Corps of Engineers in the Mobile district had documentation that said this is basically a project priority of Sonny Callahan, and it even had a little map that had the dot on the map represents congressman's residence in relation to the project. So it was pretty straightforward. But again, he was trying to hide this by just saying, oh, it's just do this law, and so anyway, we pulled that string, and so that was the story there. All right, the next one. So then I talked about assets and campaign contributions. Again, this is going back a bit. So Charlie Taylor, who's the picture there, the pixelated picture, as the Wall Street Journal does. Anyway, he was also a senior appropriator and he was a chair of one of the subcommittees. I'm forgetting which one off the top of my head. But anyway, we looked at all of his earmarks, his mostly transportation earmarks for roads and other improvements, and this was back in 2006, if I recall correctly. And so we sent one of our staff down there to North Carolina, and basically with a GPS, and documented where, both looked at the property records that he had, because he owned several properties. He was a developer before he got into Congress, and documented where he was getting earmarks in relation to his properties, and were able to demonstrate that he was basically getting earmarks that were benefiting the property values of his various properties. And so that led to that article, and then another one. So, and then oversight and transparency. So that's just talking a little bit more about Taxpayers for Common Sense, which I'm happy to do. So this is from a CBO document that just came out last month. And you can see in here how your eyes can kind of glaze over just looking at the numbers. And so it is, how do you tell the stories of this? And so you can go ahead and move ahead and I can talk about any of those numbers on there too. But so just thinking about what is the budget impact, and so, looking at the deficits and the debt, the outlays, the revenues, those are all like these numbers there that just kind of make your eyes glaze over. And the other thing that, you hear a lot about is, so you see that first one where the deficit is down. Well, that's because they were record deficits because of COVID spending. And so that delta, you should put it in context. And so 1.3 trillion is basically what our deficits were, before the pandemic. And then the debt, $31.4 trillion. And now you're going to see that hold pretty steady until the summer because of the debt ceiling and extraordinary measures, et cetera. But just to put that into perspective, and this may not reflect well on me, but when I started at TCS in 1999, and this is in then-year dollars, the debt was 5.6 trillion, and now it's 31.4 trillion. So again, it's sort of, we've been, and this under both presidents, the outlays are historically high, but those will drop because of the COVID spending. And then you can see now, this is my typo that I tried to correct. It's actually 4.9 trillion is actually up from 4 trillion. So then let's get to the other thing. And again, kind of talking about stories, and then I'd like to take any questions you have, but what's a trillion? And it's not like we're going to see a trillion of anything in our lifetime, likely. It's just, it's a big number. It's hard to get your head around. It's a million millions. It's 1,000 billions. If I gave you $1 every second in a year, you would have $31.5 million. Before it would be 31,000 years before you'd have $1 trillion. So that's just, into me anyway, I'm a numbers guy, but that just blows me away. And when I think about that, and so I think that might be it for yep. So it's just a real brief slideshow. I'm happy to answer any questions. I figured I would just kind of set the table a little bit, and anything about TCS or about the budget process or about me, it's fine. Yeah, in the back.
Republicans have said this year that they will not go through this omnibus process that they're going through before. And I was wondering, based on how that will change, does that change a significant part? Should we be changing where we're looking in terms of finding budgetary stories? What's sort of the big story, if you were compared to that, to explain more generally what you're seeing in terms of there?
It's I have to say, I mean, you can argue about some of those rules changes, but that excites budget watchdogs. The idea that they're going to do each of these bills individually, they're going to have open rules. It means that there's going to be, if that follows through, and there's been a lot of times where politicians promise one thing and do something else. But it means, though, when you have an open rule, which you don't see that often, that members of Congress, and if it's a truly open rule, they can be there on the floor and writing notes on a card and hand it to the desk, and then offer an amendment on the bill. The biggest thing is that you have to be in so what they do is they supposedly read the bill, and the member of Congress has to be on the floor and make a motion right when they get to the part of the bill that they have the amendment for. So so then they'll say move to strike the last word, and then they'll offer their amendment, and then they'll have a vote and everything. It's a pretty interesting thing, especially if you're a geek like me. But it doesn't haven't been doing open rules for, I think the last time they did it was the last time right before the BCA, so 2011, that they had an open rule on the appropriations bill. And I mean, there's ways that you can try to reduce the amendments. Mostly it's that you kind of go all the way through the night. And so, members of Congress, they're kind of old for the most part. They want to get their sleep. So, but anyway, that's something that'll be interesting. But the thing is about that is what they most likely will do, instead of doing the note card, although I remember when Senator Coburn was in the House, they basically filibustered the ag bill. And you can say, Steve, what are you talking about? Filibuster? That's a Senate thing. That's not a House thing. They filed so many amendments to strike things in there that they essentially had to made and this is under Republican control, that they had to yank the bill from the floor. So what they often do is they do a modified open rule where it'll be you have to file the amendments in the congressional record, and then at least a certain amount of time in advance, and then still you have to be on the floor to be ready to offer your amendment. If you miss it by a little bit, they're moved on, and you won't be able to offer your amendment. So I think that's something that's going to be very interesting. The other thing is, if they're really committed to doing allowing more rules or more amendments, not closing them down. I mean, the House Rules Committee historically has been, dubbed the Speaker's Committee, where essentially, you could have a more modest amendment that would likely pass, and what they would do is they would basically pick the extreme so they knew it would fail, so they can kind of control the debate. And so it's certainly something we've seen, but it'll be interesting. This is the Farm Bill year, and if they allow, there's certainly amendments that we've supported in the past that actually wouldn't let go through because they knew that they might actually pass, and they didn't want that to happen. So it'll be interesting to see, especially with some of the new members of the Rules Committee, if some of these amendments actually get through as well. So that's, to me, is the other thing that's kind of interesting and exciting about this new process. Thanks.
So for me, this might be the first budget and maybe debt ceiling fight that I'll cover fully. And so I wanted to ask you,
welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited. Just any advice on best practices or things that you see journalists do often that you think is going down a bad hole, or something that you would like to see more of or less of.
So thank you for the question. And it's the shiny object thing that, and that not sometimes you see that the budget proposes something and it gets written about like it is actually going to happen, when in reality there needs to be some skepticism incorporated into the story. I'm a noted skeptic, and so, but anyway, I think that's important because so much of what the president is going to propose, and I'm not even saying this in a negative way about President Biden or about the administration or anything like that, is never going to happen. And so yet it can sometimes be kind of breathlessly reported that, oh, he's going to cut the deficit by $2 trillion. Well, that's what they're promising. That's what we're going to see on paper anyway. But then what are the assumptions that are being made to do that? Like, what are the unrealistic tax increases? What are the unrealistic economic assumptions? That's always a good one. It's like, wow, the economy's going to be doing gangbusters in the second half of the decade. And so therefore, that's the reason how they get to their deficit reduction numbers, because we're going to generate so much revenue. Budgets never assume that there's a recession. I mean, we know there's going to be a recession at some point, but no president's budget ever assumed that there's going to be a recession. And so I think it is just being skeptical of some of the promises. And then also the other thing is looking back at what they, like I kind of mentioned here, is what are the deltas or not deltas? Did they propose this before and didn't get it through a Democratic Congress? Why do they think they're going to get it through a half Republican Congress? And so I think those are some of the things that I would encourage you to look at. And then also, I've heard rumors, I think it was CQ that said this, that Thursday we may just get the initial budget volume and then all the other materials on Monday. I don't know if that's true, so I'm not saying that, but that also is that not to leave it alone, not to stop after that first day, but kind of digging into some of the agency information by agency. So those are some of the things that I would be curious about. I'd love to read from you all.
I'm Brian Metzger with Insider. You mentioned some good resources at the top for covering all these things. I'm kind of starting from a place where I've never covered any of this stuff before. I'd like to cover it in like a good, thorough way. I guess if you have any further advice about just like how to approach it, how to like bone up on this stuff, if you're like truly just starting from nothing, like where are the best places to kind of start? I don't know. Where do I start with all this?
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I won't lie about it. And the problem is that of course, they're only telling you what they want you to write about, and so I mean, this, and so then it's trying to figure out what is not in those press releases. And it may be that for your readers, you find a certain agency that has more, is more interesting, or you dig into, because it's how do you slice this? How do you eat this elephant, if you would? It's a challenge. But so, for instance, the president proposed cutting a bunch. I mentioned the littoral combat ship. Cutting several littoral combat ships last Congress, and then Congress wouldn't let them. They basically kept them, even though the Secretary of the Navy, or actually the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Kildee, said that these won't work. They don't do the anti-submarine warfare mission that they're supposed to. They won't detect the subs. And yet Congress, because they want to keep them, because they're in Jacksonville, Florida, and there's somebody with a maintenance contract, they forced them to keep them. And you'll see this tension, and obviously that was a Democratic Congress. You'll see this tension in other places as well. So some of it is what are they trying to do and aren't being allowed to do, or and there's no easy way around it on the budget. I mean, I do think it is about looking at trends and changes, which is hard when it's your first budget, because you obviously don't have that background. You don't have 20 plus years knocking your head against the wall on budgets. But that might be a good thing too. So anyway, that I wish I could offer more, but that's about it.
Hi, I'm Naomi with the Washington Examiner. One of the things that we're being promised about with this budget is that we're going to see how the president proposes to pay for Medicare, Social Security. I'm guessing that we're going to get a briefing call that they'll sort of tell us, where they're going to draw this funding from. How do we sort of fact check that on like a balance sheet, or, how do I approach that reporting, if that makes sense? Because I haven't done this before either.
Well, so my assumption is that there's going to be some sort of tax increase that's on people with higher earners. I mean, you keep saying that $400,000 figure, which, I feel like I'm a middle class person. I wish I was making that much money, and that structure. But anyway, and so it's the question, is any of that going to ever happen? I mean, the thing is that if you talk about everything that's been taken off the table, on as far as like, you have, if you're not going to deal with defense, if you're not going to deal with Medicare and Social Security, as far as, you've basically wiped out something like 75% of the federal budget. So like you're going to have to cut everything to actually get that $2 trillion. And that's not going to happen. And so the thing is that the president can propose whatever they want in the budget request. It doesn't ever become law. And so there's going to be magic pixie dust that's going to pay for this. It's not going to be realistic. I cannot see any way that it's going to actually come to be. And Medicare, here's one other thing I want to flag. People are asking I hate it when people talk about that Social Security is going to become insolvent in 10 years. Because I think it leaves people with the idea that it's going to pay nothing. It's going to pay 75%. It's like basically in 10 years time, if what the trustees have said, I'm sorry, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but that it would reduce the benefits payments by 25%. So to me, it's technically insolvent because they can't pay everything that they promised, but it's not nothing. So that's one thing. But then the other thing on like you said about Medicare, yeah, they're going to assume that they're going to raise taxes, on some people that are wealthier individuals to do this. And it's just, again, it's going to be skepticism. But as far as knowing the actual numbers, it's not going to be really, until CBO starts reporting that you're going to have kind of impartial numbers. And it's worth noting that, the Congressional Budget Office and our entire budget process were created in 1974 on the Congressional Budget Act, Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act. And it was because Congress didn't trust the Nixon administration. Basically they had to get all their numbers from OMB, and, that wasn't a trusted source. So that's how the CBO was created at that point. And so there isn't a really, I'm sorry if I'm sounding negative, but, the thing is that it's to really accomplish what they're talking about. There's some, complex modeling that would have to be done, and so the CBO has modeled, but then also if you look to the left side, Brookings Urban has the tax policy center. I can't remember right off the top of my head. Anyway, but they have a model, and then on the right side, the tax. Wow, I'm not totally blanking. Not NTU. It's the Tax Foundation has a model as well.
Eleanor Mueller, I cover Congress for Politico's economic policy teams. And so while I've covered the budget process before, I haven't covered a debt ceiling fight before. And I'm just curious, as someone who's obviously been tracking stuff like this for a while, what do you see happening? And I know that that's the $1 million question, but what's your impression of how far congressional Republicans are willing to take this and how they're going to resolve maybe those differences within the conference?
I find it kind of pretty scary, actually, in that, we're going to enter uncharted territory. And then the question is and some of this has been raised by others as well. Are they really going to go over that cliff? Are they going to let the default happen? I think if they do default, that it will be very quickly rectified. Problem is the damage is done. I think it's funny when people point back to, what happened to do the BCA and the Budget Control Act in 2011. People mentioned that we got the U.S. debt got downgraded, and in reality, the U.S. debt, there's no FICO score in the U.S. debt. Everybody knows the situation. It's like you're not, whereas with Moody's or whatever, they're providing investors information to know whether this is a good risk or a bad risk. Everybody knows U.S. debt, So I don't think that actually has a factor in it. But I do think that all of a sudden it becomes scary if we default. That then it just costs more to finance our debt. And as you saw from the slides, we got a lot of debt. And so that becomes a really scary thing because just a small increase in the amount that we pay in interest is huge, and that by the end of this decade, net interest is expected to exceed defense spending. And it's a huge, that's the interest that you have. If you run credit card debt, that's that payment that you're making. So we're going to be talking about $700, $800 billion in interest payments that's going to quickly crowd out other areas of the budget, and that's just money that we're just throwing away, because we like to be profligate as a country. And so, unfortunately, because there's so many members of Congress that weren't here, in the BCA fight and things like that, I don't know if everybody really recognizes the risks and the concerns that I have. Now, if we get to that point, does the president just say, well, by law, I have to pay these creditors. By law, I have to pay Social Security recipients. What is the president in a position where did they ignore the debt ceiling and just carry on as usual? Or do they try to prioritize payments? Or do they actually, do we default? And it's scary, uncharted territory. I've always been hopeful. I'll put it this way. I've been consistent in the past saying that I think that I saw the debt ceiling as a opportunity to pause and reflect and think about what we've been doing, like how our debt, and to think about spending. It was an inflection point. I've decided, and our policy is that we should just get rid of the debt ceiling because it's gotten too scary. It's not. It has always been increased. It's not a useful tool anymore. It doesn't actually change behavior. The BCA got amended every single year after it was enacted, after the very first year, and so it increased. And so I just don't think it's a legitimate policy tool. It's just too blunt of an instrument.
I don't think you think that there's a very legitimate chance that we could actually hit the debt ceiling.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a chance that we will default and not pay creditors. And this whole thing about prioritizing payments and things like that, okay, we'll pay the creditors, but not spend other money or something like that. I don't think that matters in that respect. I mean, you can't. It's like you can't be a little bit pregnant. You can't a little bit default. So.
So we're visiting the Pentagon in May. Could you talk a little bit about what, yeah, now covering, because defense is such a huge part. What are your tips for covering the defense budget?
Don't trust them. And my dad was career Navy and I was Coast Guard, but which is not in the Pentagon, by the way. But anyway, it's DHS. And my classmates are now, the ones that are still in the Coast Guard are all admirals, and so I know all about them. So anyway, with the Pentagon, it is so much of it is a parochialism. I mean that you see, well, you can't move this squadron. I think it's the Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. They always do this one. It's a reserve unit out of Alabama. Really, it should be about and about what's best and what can we get for the best value for our troops, our men and women in uniform. It's a big entity. It's a lot to take on, but I think it is whatever is happening in your readership area or of interest. That's an important thing. Or is it a particular service? Right now the Commandant of the Marine Corps has a whole transformation agenda that has been a hot issue among Marines. We've supported it. We think it actually makes sense what he's trying to do, which is having more and more affordable weapon systems rather than the pricey and single. Also, kind of changing the organization of the Marine Corps. Former commandants have come out with knives on this whole policy and changing, trying to make it. And so that's something that I think is interesting. He is, at least from my recent reading, it's between him and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force as to becomes the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I think that's an interesting sort of aspect as well. And then, on the defense spending, if you look at it at historical levels, we spend a ton of money on defense. It doesn't make any sense to me that people are talking about we're going to cut defense down to 2021 levels I mean, that was just 2 years ago, and that seemed to be adequate to defend our country. How can in 2 years we have to have $40 billion more in defense spending? So I think it's a question of that. The other thing that I think it's worth looking at is pay and benefits, and my classmates won't be happy with me on that, but you know, you often hear a story about this particular military family that they have to get food stamps or something along those lines, and it's about, and I'm sympathetic, but it's about, okay, how do you address that particular problem rather than increasing everybody's salary? I mean, normally when the military's salary increases, it's a 4% bump. So it doesn't matter whether you're an O10, which is be a 4-star, or a E3, everybody gets the same percentage bump. But obviously it has a bigger impact on an E3 or an E4 non-commissioned officer than it does on an O10. And so I think it is looking at some of those. The other thing that is not reported really at all, I find shocking, is that there was a big amount of increase in benefits post 9/11. And some of that was to attract and retain the workforce, because, it's harder to get people to enlist generally when there's a war going on. But so there was a big generous increase in the benefits. And one of those is the so-called the enhanced GI Bill. So it's not the GI Bill that my dad went back to school to get his master's degree. It's not the GI Bill that would have been available to me. It's this yellow ribbon program, they call it, where members, military members can send their spouses or their kids to college. And to me, that is incredibly generous benefit that nobody outside of the military really talks about. And I find it again, it won't make me popular among my classmates, but it's like, what? We're paying for, I mean, I get it that we want to have you go back to school and everything else, but we're paying for your kids? And that doesn't make any sense to me.
Hey, Kirsten Garris, Cox Media Group. And as I said, nice to see you in person versus on Zoom for
Yes.
stories. Being in TV, obviously budgets are just hard to cover in general because I have seconds and it's numbers and people are like, what? For something like this, where can we maybe find the why does this matter or how does this impact me parts of the budget? Are there certain areas where it's like, oh, this is where we would put the child tax credit? Or I don't know if that exists, but are there areas where we can really find the this hits every American kind of items?
Well, I think the net interest thing is an interesting one, at least to me, because it's like money that we're just throwing out the door and it's just keeping going up. And it's really a consequence of our profligacy. I think that then it is about looking at, I think it is looking at the tax code and some of the issues there. There'll be a variety of tax provisions that'll be offered in the budget. There always are. And then how, you mentioned the child tax credit or enhanced child tax credit. I'm sure that'll be in there. It's something they've been talking about. But then does that, again, taxes are also not that easy to talk about as well. So I think you have your work cut out for you. But I do think it is about trying to find some of the threads on various issues that through. It could be national security spending. It could be the net interest. It certainly, if all of us are if we live long enough are going to be Medicare or Social Security beneficiaries, how are those being addressed? I mean, at some point, the idea that that you can't touch Social Security and Medicare is just completely unrealistic. And at some point, that's going to have to give. Certainly on Medicare sooner than later. On Social Security, we control the inputs and the outputs. It's a lot easier. On Medicare, the outputs are the cost of medical care. And that's a huge issue as people, deal with that. And as somebody who is 53, I'm going to be closer to those I'm right after, basically Medicare becomes insolvent, to use a term I said not to use. But anyway.
I'm Riley. I'm with the Anchorage Daily News. Because I work for the Anchorage Daily News, pay a lot of attention to earmarks. I'm wondering what you see as the future of earmarks. There's been a lot of discussion if we're actually going to keep them, if they're going to be really limited. What do you think that's going to look like going forward?
So We're the group that dubbed the Bridge to Nowhere the Bridge to Nowhere, just so
Oh,
you know. Yes.
good to know.
Yes.
I'll
You can
add
look it
that
up.
in future stories.
You
for
can
sure.
look it up. It's true. It was the Gravina Island Access Project before we got to it. Not quite as sexy, not quite as outrageous. And actually, William Safire used to write an on-language column, called it the phrase that launched 1,000 editorials. And so, but anyway, you can look it up. I guarantee you it's true. Keith Ashdown, my colleague, was the one who called it a Bridge to Nowhere. And he came up with that at Hawk and Dove, actually, if you go over it. Yep.
This is great. This is a whole story in and of itself.
Yeah, it's already been written to Tory Newmeyer when he was at Roll Call, wrote it. But anyway, so earmarks, certainly, it's interesting, because I think that they never totally went away. Actually, I know they never totally went away. Even during the moratorium, it's just got renamed to some extent. Not even just renamed, but so like we did a whole analysis in the defense spending bill of just looking at RDT&E, research, development, testing, and evaluation, which is where the bulk of the earmarks in the defense spending bill were in the past. And essentially, we could see all these ads that happened from Congress, where they essentially put money in there. And it was like, for lack of a better term, it was like one level up. So it wasn't the specific entity or the company. It was still, but it's a particular weapon system. There's somebody behind that. There's some lobbyist. They weren't requested in the president's budget. So that's all. That's we've done this analysis and it's pretty clear. And so now with earmarks, they're saying they're not going to do them in labor HHS, which historically. And believe me, we databased all the earmarks. But labor HHS had the most, not the dollar amount the most, but the most earmarks in the past and number. The dollar amount was always defense. It was about half of the total. And so, they're going to backslide. That's what's happened. The House said under the Democrats, the first year you can only get 10. The next year it said 15. The Republicans are saying 15. The Senate said, who cares? Just get what you want. And so they're going to find a way. They're going to find a way to get their money and to get their projects. And this whole thing about no monuments to me or whatever, that we're not going to allow you to have museums or things that you can name after yourself. We wrote we do a weekly newsletter called The Wastebasket, and we did one was What's Next West Virginia, about Robert Byrd, and because he named everything he could after him and his wife. But anyway, what do we call it? The edifice complex? That's it. Yeah. So anyway, it's just gonna keep unwinding. Once they pop the genie out of the bottle, then it's just going to keep unwinding, and eventually we're going to get there. And there are lawmakers that are figuring out ways to get around to get these. I think the thing on that is, so for instance, when we started doing a lot of work on earmarks, I think it was Senator Murray and other members, they stopped providing their press releases to the DC press. They would only release it to in-state places, cover outlets, because they wanted to where they got credit, not where they got criticism, and so some of it is trying to dig into that as well. Obviously, it's something that Senator Murkowski, is certainly going to be getting her share of earmarks as an appropriator, and that's been kind of the way it's gone. And certainly, late Congressman Young was big, what did he say about safety, Lou, that he stuffed it like a turkey? And so named that bill after his wife, too, by the way. Legacy for Users, her name was Lou. So anyway, having done a lot of work on earmarks over the years, they're still, lawmakers are still getting what they want, and so some of it is looking at their, some of the lobby shops. Back in its heyday, in the go-go years, you could get earmarks like nobody's business. Somebody would just leave the Appropriations Committee as a staffer, hang out a shingle, and start getting earmarks. It was kind of crazy. So anyway, I digress. I think that whether you call them, I guess, what is it, community project, requests or whatever, I would just keep watching and seeing how it slips. And certainly I would look at the bills that are the appropriations bills that are of interest to you, and you'll see that these projects start showing up in there, because who gets to decide whether an earmark is in a bill or not? The chairman of that committee. That's the judge, jury, and executioner as to what is an earmark. As a matter of fact, yeah. So I'll just leave it at that. But I think that it is something where we're going to see it continue to backslide until we're maybe not like it was in 2005, but where we had 15,000 earmarks. But it's still going to be, and also are places where, like, for instance, in the defense bill, even when there was disclosure of earmarks, and that, I think the last year, so FY10 was the last year that they had before the fiscal year 2010 was the last year that they had disclosure of earmarks before the moratorium. There was maybe 20 earmarks that exceeded $10 million, and one that was $40 million. Basically, if once it became a big ticket item, Congress decided that it wasn't an earmark. So you could add an F-35, or you could do certain things like this, but then Congress just basically said, no, that's not an earmark, it's too big, or whatever. I mean, there was no written policy, but it was just pretty evident when you look through 11,000 earmarks, which we looked through 11,000 earmarks, that it wasn't, that basically that was kind of an unwritten rule. And then the other thing is, I would argue too, the transparency has not been what, we were really promised. I mean, as far as getting a really, basically when you had the transparency from FY08 to FY10, it was charts in the back of the bill. We had to optically scan all of those bills, to then put it into a usable database that you could actually see. And still, that's basically what you have. They're not providing you something that you can actually track exactly what every lawmaker is getting and obtaining. They do that for requests, but not actually for the ones that actually make it into the bill that are awards and that you can actually find.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll leave my business cards here, and feel free to reach out. I don't know if I have enough, but anyway, you got kind of, during the pandemic, you get out of shape on the whole business card game. So, but no, I do have enough. All right. So anyway, but yes, feel free to reach out on any topic dealing with federal spending or revenue. We're happy to help you tell the story. Thank you.